What I'm going to talk to you about today, or we're going to have a conversation about, is the architecture of Frantz and Spence. And I call this lecture, I did it a couple years ago for the Michigan Historic Preservation Network, I call it Becoming Modern, the Architecture of Frantz and Spence. Franz and Spence was an architectural firm that was started in Saginaw in 1925, and the principals were James Spence and Robert Franz. Both were graduates of the University of Michigan School of Architecture, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes more. And when you think of the architecture of Franz and Spence, at least before I started working in their collection, and the museum is very fortunate that amongst our holdings, we have much of the archives from Franz and Spence's office, which are now fully cataloged, and we have, I think it's between 300 and 500 sets of architectural drawings for the buildings they did, and it's an amazing body of work. And I call this exhibit Becoming Modern because I always used to think of Franz and Spence as doing very exacting historical revival buildings. I think of this house on Edgewood Road in Saginaw Township as kind of the quintessential Franz and Spence home, and of course probably one of the largest and best known of their Colonial Revival residences is the Montague Inn, and we'll talk more of kind of the procedures in their office and look at some of their drawings. But they're also, Franz and Spence were incredibly talented in doing modern buildings. And in a way I could call this the revolution that wasn't quite a revolution. Sometimes when we look at architectural history, we think that there was the Colonial Revival and then various historical revival styles, and there's a complete break with the past in modern architecture. And we're not going to go into a great deal of detail about architectural styles, but we're going to have some fun looking at it. There's this statement that you might have seen in the Cloplay door ad in the magazines that God is in the details, and they quote Mies van der Rohe, the famed modernist architecture, as saying it. So I thought it was kind of fun to start looking at a detail that is so typical of Franz and Spence's houses of the 1920s and 30s. They used a patented Pintle Hinge, try to say that, patented Pintle Hinge that looks like an olive, and if you go to the Montague Inn, the front door has it on, you'll see it all over. And it was a patent that I think it's 1925, but it's also a detail that appears in Alden B. Dowell's residences. And it's fun when you look at the two kind of compare, because here you have the detail in Franz and Spence's houses that looks so perfectly Colonial Revival and traditional in like the Montague Inn or the house that we just looked at on Edgewood Road. But when you go to Alden B. Dowell's home or the Mary Dow house just down the street here and look at the front door, there's the exact hinge used and looks incredibly contemporary. So here is the hinge in the Mary Dow house. Here's the 1925 patent. And here's the same type of hinge used in the Montague Inn. And, you know, you might think, and we'll talk about a connection there where Dow may have gotten the idea or who might have brought it into the office. But, you know, those type of details, it's interesting. When you take them out of context or put them in a different context, they look so different. I know everybody just goes looking around at door hinges all the time. It's the type of thing I do. And lo and behold, and here I was thinking, I've been intrigued for a long time by that kind of dichotomy of the olive-shaped hinge or the Pintle Hinge. But I was at the Art Institute of Chicago a couple years ago while I was getting ready for this talk, and I was looking at this Venetian door from the 18th century, and lo and behold, I found the predecessor to the olive-shaped Pintle Hinge. And actually, when I started doing research, it was patented in 1925, but what was patented wasn't that whole idea of a Pintle Hinge, and that olive shape, but was how it was put in the door. And it's one that is supposed to make life easier when hanging the door, although I've been told it is the other way around. But what happens, the two parts, without going into a long dissertation about hinges, you can lift the door off rather than having to take the hinge apart. So with that little thing, not all things that are traditional, and not all things that are modern are modern. And with that kind of in mind, let's kind of look at some of the buildings at Frantz and Spence. What we know about Frantz and Spence is a lot, actually. It was probably at one point the largest office in Saginaw, and it operated from 1925 to 1960. And that year the firm split, and it became Robert Franz went out on his own, and it became Spence, Smith, and Forsyth. And they were really, for a very long time, the most prominent architects in Saginaw. And judging from what we have on their file, it's everything from schools to factory buildings to fine residences to the Saginaw News building that's being restored at this time that's featured in the exhibit that we have. James Spence was the son of the founder of Spence Brothers. I think I'm right and haven't skipped a generation. So he was well steeped in construction. Robert Franz was from Pennsylvania and had moved to Saginaw to work in the office of Cowles and Muchler in the 20s. Both had studied at the University of Michigan. And the University of Michigan really in the 20th century becomes a very important part of Saginaw's architectural heritage. The architecture program at the University of Michigan was started by Emil Lorch. Lorch taught using a system called pure design. And without getting into a lot of stylistic things that are beyond probably my capability to describe, pure design means you work out the problem and move forward with the design. So maybe at first it might be seem odd to you that a firm that could have designed the Montague Inn could design the Saginaw News building, but it's really an approach to really resolving the problem. And Lorch was the original first dean of the School of Architecture at U of M and really organized the program in the teens. And here he is again. And Lorch, in later years after his retirement, became very interested in historic preservation. And actually, that's the one time I've used his files at the Bentley Library, because he has a lot of things that he collected about information about Saginaw buildings when people would write to him trying to enlist his aid in saving buildings, especially the Weber House in Saginaw. We know that Robert Franz graduated. He didn't retire. He graduated in 1920, and he came to Saginaw to work for the firm of Cowles and Muchler. Now, it's also kind of in this continuum of understanding the architectural practice in Saginaw, or in the country really, that how architects were trained changed profoundly in the 20th century. That in the 19th century, it was kind of an unregulated system of apprenticeship. You kind of decided you wanted to be an architect, and this worked till the early 20th century. You worked in an office. You kind of decided, I think, when you wanted to go out on your own. There was no registration, and I think that probably I guess the registration was if your building stood up and they made sense to people and they hired you, you could continue to hang your shingle out. That changed profoundly in the 20th century. Cowles and Muchler were right on that edge. They had been one of the larger firms in Saginaw. Their buildings in Saginaw include one of my favorite, the Comfort Station at Forest Lawn Cemetery, numerous fine residences. They did a number of commercial buildings, and actually had designed the old Saginaw News building that we have the lion's heads from, that's in the lobby. And one of the last buildings done by the firm was Jefferson One, or was the People's Savings and Loan, which is right across the street from our building. When Robert Franz came to Saginaw, he started working for the firm of Cowles and Muchler, and worked there for about 5 years. James Spence was a little bit younger and graduated in 1924, if I'm reading my notes correctly. And James Spence would have been at the University of Michigan when the famed architect Elio Saarinen was lecturing, and he was the first architect at Cranbrook. What we know is that in 1925 is the year that the firm officially started. This ad appeared, and Robert Franz had been on his own maybe a year or so before the office, before he went into partnership with James Spence. And we have in our files, I think they numbered their drawings sequentially. I think we're missing project 1. I think we have like project 1 and like 3 and then 5, because we don't have the complete file, but really quite complete. And for the later projects, we even have the job files. The firm did very well, and they weathered the Depression. Remember, they started in 25 when there was a building boom, but in 1930, almost all construction stopped in Saginaw, but Franz and Spence had a lot of commercial work. They were able to do schools, and they survived the Depression and actually hired a couple of other architects who had been independent to work for their firm. And they were both, James Spence and Robert B. Franz, were highly regarded in the architectural profession in Michigan. Robert Franz would serve as the chair of the president of the Michigan Society of Architects, the Michigan AIA chapter, and were well recognized throughout the community. And I'm going to start with probably one of the most, what I think, traditional Franz and Spence houses. It is the Schupp residence on the corner of Phelan and Owen. And the Schupp were Otto Schupp. He was on a lot of boards in Saginaw, the Bank of Saginaw Insurance and in industry, and his wife was the daughter of Ransom Moles. And this house is deceptively modest looking. It's about a 5,000-foot residence and incredibly carefully detailed. One of the things on these early files that, as we go through their architectural drawings, it's fun to look at, that there's much, the details can take pages, but the structural details on these early buildings, which is typical of all buildings, really might fit a page or two for this huge house, but there's pages on all the custom-made cabinets, all the custom-made paneling and details, and it's interesting how that changes. But the house was very carefully detailed and modeled after colonial examples, as was the Montague Inn. The Montague Inn is probably one of the best known, and I simply went to their website and didn't take photographs, I cheated. But, it's really the epitome of Franz and Spence fine residential work from that period. Carefully detailed, carefully scaled, and very elegant, and really makes a statement about a particular time and a particular way of life. The firm, and today we sometimes don't think of the smaller projects, and this isn't one of the smallest. We have plans for something as simple as a bay window in R.C. Morley's house on Genesee Avenue. But they would undertake fairly modest projects, and this one's kind of in between. This is the First Church of Christ the Scientist on Hayden Street that was designed by Cowles and Muchler. And this is the way the building looked originally, but now if we look at it, this is what it looks like, because what Franz and Spence did is really covered the whole building with an addition that wraps around the original building, except for the parking lot side is the one place you can see the original building. Of course, the dome was part of Cowles and Muchler's work. And we're very fortunate when the Depression started and Cowles and Muchler both passed away, Clarence Cowles and Mr. Muchler, whose name eludes me without my notes, passed away. One of their employees went to work for Franz and Spence and took with them about 60 sets of drawings, including the original ones for these. So we have in our collection a number of original sets of drawings from Cowles and Muchler. And hints at a more less traditional form of architecture really surface as we go through the files right from the start. This is the plans for the hangar at the Saginaw Airport, or at that now known as the Harry Brown Airport, and you can see how it's a much more structural, straightforward design and really designed to reflect the program that's at hand. It's interesting, they always made certain their work was published. They appeared in Architectural Record, local publications, and this is today the David Gomez Health Center, but this is in its first thing, which is a very traditionally inspired building. So we start to see, it's easy to think that what happened is when we look at the Saginaw News at one end of the firm's work, but we look at the Montague end at the other, it's easy to think, oh, the world's changed, World War II happened, new people in the firm, they're just managing and they have all new, a new philosophy. Nobody wants Colonial Revival buildings anymore. But it really isn't that case at all. We start to see this movement in modernism really happens throughout their files right at the same time that the more traditional buildings. One of my favorite buildings from the 30s in Saginaw is Central Fire Station, which is by Franz and Spence. So that's only a couple years after the Montague Inn. This one, who can tell me where this is? Oh, come now, I can't be the only person. No, I can't be the only person with the answer for this. It doesn't exist. It was never constructed. It was, if somebody said, this is a band shell that was designed for Thistle Field. Does anybody know where Thistle Field is? And it was a band shell, and it must have been very dear to the firm's heart because it was a WPA project, and it came in higher than anticipated, but the correspondence, and it remained on the books for a long time. And what we have found, most of what we have in the file, 95% of them are constructed buildings. Very few of the buildings that were not constructed did they seem to retain the plans for by the time that the firm was dissolved and stuff. So this one was kept, and it really is a great building and would have been really a fun building. But that is on the same time, the house on Edgewood Road that was constructed, I think it's 1935. I mean, that's at the same time. So you can see really that comparison of with style happening in the office. So it's not just a divorce. It isn't a sequential thing, a move towards modernism. It's a parallel movement. Robert Franz and James Spence each designed their own residence in Edgewood, and Mrs. Franz was trained as a landscape architect at the University of Michigan, and their home had an absolutely wonderful miniature formal garden in the back, and then she did the landscaping for some other homes. So in the garden, unfortunately, is gone. This is a home, this is about the same time as the other house. So you see the much more functional, rectangular forms, not at all traditionally inspired. And we see that happening at the same time. This one's contemporary with the home on Edgewood. We see them reverting back a few years later to Colonial Revival. And it is what the client demands. And I've noticed this. I had this conversation, Frederick Beck Bessinger, who was another Saginaw architect who was not formally trained, but he had a wonderful personal arts and crafts style based on the arts and crafts movement, but you'll find these traditional details inside. And I was once having a conversation with an architect in Saginaw, and he pointed out that it was probably the client's demand, but when you start to look at the work and how much freedom he had on some of these homes, you realize that sometimes it isn't just the client wants something. Sometimes there's different ways to solve a problem, and it's not an absolute denial of the past with an embrace of the future or present. Just another one of their Colonial Revival homes. This one is a transformation. If you looked at our exhibit, we have this. It was designed by Albert Kahn, and it was right behind Jeffers Park. This is the Consumers Building, which still stands. This is where the police station is today. The Bank of Saginaw was really kind of a tragic story. It was the larger bank compared to Second National Bank. They were the two major banks, and the Bank of Saginaw was the larger of the two. However, the Depression hit after each of them had constructed really magnificent new buildings. The Second National Bank one, that's now the Huntington Tower, and the Bank of Saginaw, which was right over, just a few blocks from here, was completed a couple years later in 1927. The Bank of Saginaw closed during the banking crisis of 1932, never to reopen. And in 1939 was purchased by Sears and Roebuck, and Franz and Spence reworked it. And if you remember, who remembers the old Sears and Roebuck store? That is actually the Bank of Saginaw, and actually Harold Evans used to talk about, before it was demolished, they went up into the attic to look at what remained of Albert Kahn's decorative ceiling. So, they were very comfortable altering and working that. This is really my new favorite building in Saginaw. It's gone. It was this. It was on the corner of Tuscola and Baum, and it was the Salvation Army Citadel. It was designed by Carl Maycumber, who was also a graduate of the University of Michigan. And it was completed, I think, in 28 or 29. And in 1948, Franz and Spence was engaged to add a small addition to the building. And the newspaper comments, so although, and this isn't verbatim, but although modern in style, it's harmonious with the original building. And that's the original Citadel. This is the presentation drawing for the building, and here's the completed building, which is actually, does anyone remember it? No, it was demolished. It was with us for about 25 years, and nobody seems to remember the building, and it looks like it was really quite wonderful. A really interesting project that Franz and Spence did, and Robert Franz was a member of the First Congregational Church, so he was very involved in the centennial expansion of the building. The original building was designed by Gordon Lloyd, and Franz and Spence, very early in their career, had added on this part, this in the back, the auditorium that's in the back of the building. And as a centennial celebration for the church, they undertook a major expansion in the construction of an education wing on the southern side of the building. Now, a few years before that, they had actually proposed designing this small chapel that was never constructed. And it's interesting, we have the notes from the meeting on the church, the addition, and they noticed the references where they were referring back to. So in 1935, window portfolio, buttress portfolio 225, wood ceilings, Kent School, page 83, and these is from, it's a book, Architecture, and then the work of Crane and Ferguson, plate 4. So they really recite these historic references in their design, which I thought was really a nice document of it. And that's what the interior of the proposed chapel in 46 would have looked like. After the war ended, of course, and they undertook the centennial expansion, something different transpired in a much larger addition. The congregation, Mary Dowell, had commissioned her nephew, Alden B. Dowell, in 1936 to design a small home that functioned like a large home, which it did, I think, and it's just really a magical small building. And it had been, Mary Dowell passed away, I think, in 52, and in 53, I think I have the years right, the church would acquire Mary Dowell's house, and they used it as a time for, unattached to the church, but used it for various functions, and renamed it Plymouth House. So in 1955, when they undertook an enlargement, they decided the Mary Dowell house, and I've heard some sources, I can't find any documentation, but when they purchased the house from Mary Dowell's heirs, that there was an agreement they would leave the house somewhat intact, but I have only a verbal story of that. But we do know is that they paid roughly I think it was $32,000 or $35,000 for the house in 1952 or 53, which is a lot of money at that time for a very small house and a very small lot, but it allowed them to add a much larger addition. And this isn't exactly the way the addition would be completed. But in it, and Robert Franz was involved in the design and in the really promotion of the project, they comment how the different styles of architecture will be reflective of the church that joins everyone together and all of the different voices forming one harmonious unit. And that's not verbatim, but it's pretty close to the sentiment of it. I believe I quoted it accurately. So it's interesting how the design evolved and still is today. So you have really this mid-century modern chapel that makes some reference to the original building. The Mary Dowell house, slightly altered, but the interior left intact inside, is joined by this glazed loggia that joins everything together. And it really makes a really wonderful statement on Jefferson Avenue and really encompasses a century of evolving taste and styles. And that's just the Mary Dowell house today. And since this photograph is taken, these windows have been restored, which really were left intact originally. So what happened was the house became almost like this period room in a museum. And if you have not had the pleasure of going in to look at it, it's really quite amazing, because when you start walking down the hallway, all of a sudden you're confronted with the exterior wall of this 1935 house by Alden B. Dow inside. One project that is just kind of fun, that talks more about the architectural process. They designed the Jewish community, the first part, what would become Temple B'nai Israel, but it was the Jewish Community Center. And after World War II, there was an organization to provide designs for Jewish community centers in smaller communities. And this was the design that was provided. It was by a fairly well-known architect, and I don't have my notes here. And this would have been by the National Jewish Welfare Board, and this is the design they proposed. But what Franz and Spence ended up devising was really profoundly different, not inspired by the other one, but really, once again, kind of this very contemporary building, but that also has some very subtle references to the past, and is really was a very handsome building, and later had another addition added onto it by Beach and Waters. But at the same time they're doing that, they continue to provide some designs for traditional homes in Saginaw. This one on Brockway Place is really interesting because it could have passed for one of their more straightforward Colonial Revival designs, but then you start looking, it has a glass block entranceway. So it's really kind of this wonderful combination. Their own office, which was on Washington Avenue, roughly where the parking ramp is today. This is the exterior design. One of the buildings that they did earlier in their career and added on to later was the J.C. Penney building, which is on Washington Avenue, or it's the Chase block. It's right next to the Eddy building. This one was never constructed, but this was an annex for Heaven Riches. The original building was by Carl Maycumber, who worked in the office at that time, and I think may have been somewhat involved in some of these. I think this one might postdate him. But this one was for one of the proposals they did. One of the more interesting ones that has just been demolished was this bank on South Michigan Avenue, which I was very fond of. Franz and Spence had a long history on this site. Now, sometimes we think that modern architects are always the enemies of the past, and you're going to say that when you see what happens, but the modern building is gone. And I do want to point out that one of the outspoken people for the preservation of this building was Robert Franz. At the same time he had completed the design, Franz and Spence designed the post office on South Michigan. On South Washington. I've only lived in Saginaw my entire life, and I don't get the streets correct. At the same time, he had completed and was very proud of the building that his firm had designed on South Washington. He also was an outspoken advocate amongst many people, but a leader in the preservation of this building. So when you look at this, don't always judge. The past moves forward, and the sad part is that this building is gone and we have a vacant lot. So this is where we start. This was George Burroughs Residence on South Michigan, right next to the Baptist Church. In the 1930s, Frantz and Spence redesigned the Burroughs home for their daughter, Julia Fowler, and removed the Belvedere, or the Belvedere may have already been gone, and removed the porch, designed these doors. And I don't have a photograph that documents this is exactly what happened. In the 1950s, the site was acquired by the bank. They demolished the Burroughs Fowler residence and proceeded to have Frantz and Spence design this building, which was demolished last summer. And it's a very geometric building with a curtain wall in between and these wonderful square corners, which one provided a vault, one was a stairway. The plans are beautiful for it. And just, it is. And one of the houses from the same time, this is from I think from 48, this is a couple years before that, is Frank Anderson's house on the Dixie Highway, all constructed of concrete. Anybody recognize this? This is the YMCA. And the interesting story of the YMCA, and we have the donor boards there, and buildings tell so many different stories about a community. And the YWCA is really one of those that really has a great story with it, because the Y had been on the west side on Michigan Ave, on North Michigan, a couple blocks from Court Street, and in the post-war period decided to expand. Of course, at that time, a Y would have lodging or a hotel attached to it. So, the idea of it has a pool, not so much a fitness center like today, but meeting rooms, recreation space for students, and then the room over here. So really the program is really designed to reflect that. So the Y started construction, I think in 56 or 57. The building wasn't completed till 1960 because they had difficulty raising the funds. It took them 3 years to build the building. And when you look at the construction photos, you'll see there's this forest of weeds around the building. And you're thinking, gosh, how could this have grown up so quickly? Well, it's because it took so long to construct the building. Same time, this is, for those of you who occasionally have a chicken dinner in Frankenmuth, this is the original room at Zender's, where they created a space that really reflected Zender's heritage, although it doesn't incorporate a lot of details from the original room building, but it's a really handsome space. The post office building, which I've alluded to. The Saginaw Club is a building you may not recognize Frantz and Spence's work on, but they did a lot. This is what the club originally looked like. It's had numerous additions and alterations over the year. This is what it looked like at about 1959 or in the early 60s. And the porch was deteriorating, so this even has the estimates. So Frantz and Spence undertook a plan for designing a new front porch. And the results were met with great approval by the staff. And Dr. Manning wrote to my dear Robert, I would like to express my pleasure with the work you've done at the Saginaw Club. You have used imagination and admirable restraint in tidying up this aged architectural anachronism. And one of the projects that right now is really I would like much more than I did 30 years ago. The last time I worked here is the Saginaw News Building, which has really, I think, grown much more graceful with age. This is the building, and it really reflects kind of the different, it's very functional in that it reflects some of the different functions that are going on in the building, how it's organized. And one of the last projects, as I said, that we have in our files, Robert Franz would die in 1971, James Spence in 1970, and each of them went their own way after 1960, but one of the latter projects we have in the file is the Saginaw Township Hall, which you can't get much more Colonial Revival than the Saginaw Township Hall. This is just kind of a fun way to stop. Old world's architectural wonders impress returned Saginaw traveler more than political woes of today, and that was a trip that Robert Franz took in 1953. So in short, when you look at Saginaw's building, don't discount some of the newer ones as really, and actually, when you look today, the additions that Franz and Spence made to the Saginaw Club are we're almost as far away from those as Robert Franz was in the early 60s when he was making the changes to the building. So with that, that's going to be my conclusion, which isn't the grandest conclusion I've ever made, but it's really fun to look at the history of buildings and how they relate to and capture the story of our community.